My name is Eleanor Moore. I'm 31 years old and I moved out of my family's house without telling anyone I was leaving that day because I didn't want another conversation that turned into explanations I had already given too many times. And on the night everything started, I was alone in my new loft on the east side of Madison, Wisconsin, sitting on a kitchen stool. I bought secondhand eating pasta straight from the container after reheating it twice, and still forgetting to finish it. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because I had gotten used to postponing small needs, the same way I had postponed bigger ones for years, telling myself I would get to them later. That later would be easier, and the apartment was quiet in a way that felt unfinished rather than calm. Boxes still stacked against one wall because unpacking felt like admitting I planned to stay, and I picked up my phone only because I was waiting for a grocery delivery alert I had delayed again to save money. My thumb opening X without thinking the way it always had when I wanted a few minutes of noise, and the first thing I saw was my mother's name, Patricia Moore, bold at the top of my screen, attached to a post that already had more likes and replies than anything I had ever written. And I stared at it before reading because my body recognized the feeling before my brain did the familiar tightening that came when I realized I was about to be talked about instead of talked to. And when I read the post, it was clear it was about me, moving out framed like a joke about irresponsibility, about how some people think independence means running away, written casually enough that strangers felt invited to laugh along. And my first instinct was to reply to clarify, to explain why I left and how long I had thought about it. But I didn't, because I had learned that explanations in my family were usually treated like entertainment rather than information, so instead, I read the post again, then a third time, and took a screenshot telling myself I would decide what to do later, even though I already knew that staying quiet was going to last longer than anyone expected. I didn't plan to keep checking the post, but silence has a way of pulling attention back to the thing you're refusing to touch, and over the next few hours my phone kept lighting up as the replies multiplied first, with strangers making jokes that felt impersonal enough to ignore. And then, with names, I recognized my Aunt Clara, replying with a comment about how some people don't understand responsibility until real life teaches them, my stepfather Howard adding a laughing emoji and a line about how moving out doesn't magically turn rent into success. My younger brother Ryan chiming in with a joke about how I'd be back when things got hard, and each comment landed differently than the stranger's laughter, because these were people who knew how long I had stayed, how many times I had said I was tired, how often I had stepped in quietly to cover gaps no one wanted to acknowledge, and I felt the familiar urge to respond carefully, to choose words that wouldn't escalate anything, to remind them of context they already had, but experience had taught me that careful words in my family often became proof that I was being dramatic. So I stayed still and kept watching, noticing how the tone shifted once it was clear I wasn't replying, how the jokes became sharper as if my absence was an invitation rather than a boundary, and I took screenshots of everything without thinking too much about why not as evidence for a fight, but because some instinct told me that letting the moment pass unrecorded would feel worse later. And as the night went on, I thought about all the small ways I had learned to disappear when attention turned unkind, how I used to clean the kitchen during arguments, so I wouldn't have to choose sides, how I picked up extra work shifts when money got tight, instead of asking questions how I stayed later than necessary, because leaving early always came with comments. And sitting there in my quiet apartment, I realized that moving out hadn't changed how they saw me yet. It had just given them a new angle, and the hardest part wasn't the public humiliation, but the realization that none of them paused to wonder why I left. They simply filled in the reason that fit the story they were already telling, and I set my phone face down on the counter again, telling myself that if I answered now, it would turn into a conversation I'd already had too many times, and that for once I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't rush in to smooth things over. As the comments kept stacking up over the next few days, I found myself thinking less about what they were saying now, and more about how familiar the tone felt, because this wasn't new behavior created by a social media post, but something that had been rehearsed quietly for years inside the house I had just left. Starting back when I was in my early 20s and moved back temporarily after college, a word that stretched itself thin without anyone noticing. And I remembered how it began with small, reasonable requests that were never framed as obligations, like covering the electric bill 1 month because work had been slow for my mother, or picking up groceries on my way home because I had flexible hours, or staying in on weekends because someone needed help with paperwork they didn't understand. And none of it felt unfair on its own, especially because I told myself families were supposed to work like that, with everyone giving a little more when they could. But the pattern only moved in one direction, and over time, the giving stopped being something I chose and became something that was expected, so expected that no one mentioned it unless it was missing. And I thought about how I used to wake up earlier than everyone else to answer client emails before the house got loud, how I adjusted my freelance deadlines around family schedules, how I paid for repairs quietly because it felt easier than asking who should be responsible, how my work was always described as not a real job, even as it paid for real expenses, and reading my aunt's comment about responsibility made me think of the nights I stayed up recalculating budgets, so no one else would have to worry, while my stepfather's joke about rent reminded me of how often I had transferred money without labeling it, because labeling it would have turned it into a conversation, and conversations always ended with someone laughing and telling me I took things too seriously. And my brother's comment hurt in a different way, because I remembered driving him to job interviews when his car broke down, telling myself it was temporary too, and the more I sat with these memories, the clearer it became that what upset me wasn't just the humiliation of being mocked publicly, but the ease with which they all stepped into that narrative as if it fit perfectly with the version of me they had been comfortable with for years, the one who stayed, who adjusted, who absorbed inconvenience without turning it into conflict, and I realized that moving out hadn't broken that image yet, because I had done it quietly, without forcing anyone to confront the absence I left behind, and in a strange way, that realization made it easier to keep my silence, because I could see that responding now would only feed the same pattern, me explaining, and them deciding whether my explanation was acceptable. And I didn't want to negotiate my own history anymore, so I kept collecting screenshots. Not with a plan for revenge or exposure, but because I wanted to remember this feeling accurately later, the way it felt to finally see the pattern clearly, instead of questioning whether I was imagining it. And each day I didn't respond, felt uncomfortable in a new way, like resisting an instinct I had practiced for most of my adult life. But it also felt honest, and honesty, I was learning, didn't always come with relief right away. There was something else sitting underneath my silence that I hadn't named yet, not because it was dramatic or secret in the way people imagine, but because it had been part of my life for so long that it felt almost ordinary. And that was the fact that I had known for years that the house everyone was joking about me running away from was not as simple as they believed, ever since my grandmother passed and left behind a will that no one talked about openly because it complicated things. And I remembered sitting in a small legal office on a rainy afternoon when I was 24, listening as the attorney explained the arrangement in a careful voice, how my grandmother had structured ownership in a way meant to protect me if things ever went bad, how my name appeared where no one expected it to, how the intention was never to create leverage, but to create stability. And I remembered nodding along while feeling a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. Because at that age, I was still trying to prove that I didn't need special treatment, that I could earn my place by being useful, by being flexible, by not making waves. And when I brought it up to my mother later, she brushed it aside with a comment about paperwork and intentions and how families don't keep score. And I let it drop because pushing the issue would have shifted the balance in ways I wasn't ready to handle. And over the years, that knowledge became something I carried quietly like a folded document at the bottom of a drawer, never used, but always there. And when expenses came up or repairs were needed, I contributed more than my share without mentioning it, telling myself that this was what peace looked like, that keeping things smooth mattered more than being technically right. And even when I started earning more consistently through my work, I didn't change the arrangement. I didn't ask for rent discussions or boundaries. Because I had learned that asserting those things came with a cost I wasn't sure I wanted to pay yet. And now, watching the comments roll in about how I didn't understand responsibility or ownership, I felt the weight of that choice more clearly than ever, not as regret exactly, but as recognition, because I could see how my silence over the years had allowed a simpler story to settle in everyone's mind. One where I stayed, because I couldn't make it on my own, where my contributions were favors rather than structure, where my presence was convenient until it wasn't, and the temptation to correct the record rose sharply in those moments, especially when strangers echoed my family's words with confidence. But I resisted it because I knew that revealing the truth too early would turn the conversation into something else. Entirely a debate about fairness and intent, and whether I was being manipulative by not saying anything sooner. And I wasn't ready to have my motives dissected by people who had never noticed how carefully I had been holding everything together. So instead, I sat with the discomfort of being misunderstood, reminding myself that I hadn't stayed quiet out of fear, but out of habit, and that habits could be unlearned slowly. And as the days passed, I found myself less interested in defending the house or my choices, and more focused on observing how easily people assumed they knew the full story, because that assumption was the same one I had lived under for years, and recognizing it clearly without rushing to fix it felt like the first real shift I had made since leaving. After the initial surge of attention settled into a steady trickle of comments, my life outside the screen kept moving in ways that felt almost disconnected from what was happening online. And each morning, I woke up in my loft, made coffee in a chipped mug I'd brought from the old house, and opened my laptop to client messages that had nothing to do with my family or the version of me being discussed by strangers, and I took on extra projects without announcing them to anyone. Partly because the work was there, and partly because I had spent years building a habit of absorbing more than I needed to, saying yes, automatically filling gaps before anyone asked. And my income had been growing quietly for a while by then, not in a sudden leap, but in small compounding increments that came from keeping relationships steady and delivering consistently the kind of progress that doesn't look impressive from the outside because it doesn't come with milestones people can point to. And as I worked through revisions late at night, I thought about how often I had hidden that stability back home, how I downplayed my earnings when bills came up so no one would feel uncomfortable, how I let jokes about my flexible schedule stand even when it meant rearranging my own deadlines to fit everyone else's plans. And the comments under my mother's post kept echoing that same misunderstanding that moving out meant I was finally testing adulthood, rather than continuing it somewhere else. And there were moments when the urge to correct that narrative came back sharply, especially when a client paid an invoice that covered more than a month of my old household expenses. But I reminded myself that proving capability had never changed how I was treated. Before, it had only raised the bar for what was expected of me, and I noticed that even without responding, the post had altered something subtle in my family's behavior. Because messages started coming through privately asking practical questions: where I was staying, how much rent cost in that area, whether the neighborhood was safe, questions that acknowledged my move without acknowledging the way it had been mocked. and I answered them briefly and neutrally, not coldly, but without offering reassurance, and that restraint felt unfamiliar, like walking past a door I used to open automatically. And as the days passed, I realized that staying quiet wasn't about waiting for the right moment to speak, but about learning what happened when I didn't rush to fill silence with explanations, because in that space, I could see more clearly how much of my role had been built around preventing discomfort for everyone else. And working late in my quiet apartment, watching the city lights reflect off the window glass, I began to understand that whatever came next wouldn't be about exposing anyone or winning an argument. It would be about deciding how much of myself I was still willing to offer without being asked, and that decision, unlike the post or the screenshots, couldn't be made all at once. Around that time, I started seeing Ethan again, not in any dramatic sense, but through the kind of slow reconnection that happens when two people live in the same city long enough and keep running into each other's names in old email threads. And we met for coffee one afternoon near the square, sitting outside because the weather was mild and neither of us wanted to commit to anything enclosed. And he asked how the move was going in a way that sounded casual, but carried curiosity underneath it. The kind that comes from someone who still remembers how things used to be. And I told him it was fine that I liked the quiet, which was true, even if I hadn't learned how to sit comfortably inside it yet. And as we talked, he mentioned the post without naming it directly, saying he'd seen something online and hoped I was okay, and I noticed how carefully he phrased it, as if he didn't want to step into something he wasn't invited into. And I thanked him and changed the subject. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I was tired of framing my life through other people's reactions. And later, as we walked back toward our cars, he made an offhand comment about how brave it was to finally strike out on my own, and I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger exactly, but the quiet exhaustion of being misunderstood in a way that sounded complimentary, and I almost corrected him, almost told him that this wasn't a leap, so much as a continuation, that I had been carrying more responsibility than most people realized for a long time, but I stopped myself because I could hear how that explanation would land, like justification, like proof, that I cared too much about how I was perceived, and instead I let the moment pass, watching him nod thoughtfully as if he had drawn a conclusion that made sense to him. And on the drive home, I thought about how often my life had been interpreted by people who only saw the parts that fit neatly into a story they already understood, and how rarely I had challenged those interpretations unless they became actively uncomfortable, and even then only gently. And I realized that the post hadn't created this dynamic. It had simply made it visible, giving everyone permission to speak confidently about a version of me that had always existed in their minds. And back in my apartment, I sat at my desk and reviewed a contract for a new client that paid more than I used to make in a quarter, back when I first moved home. And I signed it without telling anyone, without feeling the need to share the win or use it to counter a narrative. And that felt like progress of a different kind, quieter and less satisfying in the short term, but more solid, because it wasn't about being seen correctly by others. It was about finally seeing myself clearly enough to stop correcting the record on everyone else's behalf. And as I added the signed document to a folder I had labeled simply "Work," I thought about how this pattern extended beyond my family, how often I had tried to manage other people's comfort by explaining my choices in advance. And I wondered what would happen if I stopped doing that altogether, not as an act of rebellion, but as an experiment in honesty, letting my actions exist without footnotes. And the idea felt unsettling and relieving at the same time, which I took as a sign that it was probably overdue. The change didn't arrive as an apology or a confrontation, and that was how I knew it was real, because it showed up in hesitation instead of noise. in the way messages started coming later and, with fewer certainties attached to them, my mother no longer opening with explanations but with questions. She didn't finish my aunt deleting comments and pretending she hadn't my sister texting things like, "People are asking," without saying who or why, as if naming it would give it more weight than she was ready to carry. And I stayed where I was in my own space, watching this slow unraveling without stepping in to stabilize it, even though that instinct still tugged at me out of habit, because for years I had been the one smoothing edges before anyone else had to feel uncomfortable. And letting go of that role felt both unnatural and overdue, and the first moment it really landed was when my sister finally called her voice quieter than I was used to, telling me that at work someone had pulled her aside and asked, not laughing, not teasing, but plainly why our family thought it was normal to humiliate one person together, and she told me she hadn't known how to answer that. She'd laughed weakly and changed the subject. And when she said that, I recognized the same maneuver I had used countless times, the small evasions meant to keep things moving, and after that the signs multiplied in subtle ways. My mother mentioning that a neighbor had brought up the post and that it didn't sound the way she meant it. My aunt asking if I was mad in a tone that assumed I would rush to reassure her. My father finally texting to ask when I planned to pick up the rest of my things. Practical questions framed as peace offerings, and through all of it there was a noticeable absence. No one asked me how it felt. No one asked what I needed. They were all focused on whether this moment would pass on its own, or whether something needed to be done to make it go away, and I understood then that silence had changed its function. It was no longer something I was enduring. It had become the condition that allowed the situation to fully exist without interference. And the longer I maintained it, the more the story they had told stopped feeling amusing and started feeling exposed. Because without my participation, there was nothing to balance it, no alternate version to dismiss just the original words sitting where they had been left. And I realized that this was the point where consequences begin in real life, not with dramatic fallout, but with discomfort that can't be reassigned, when people are forced to sit with the image they put out and discover that it doesn't look the way they expected once no one rushes in to soften the edges for them. What shifted next didn't come from a post or a message but from paperwork, the kind that doesn't care how anyone feels about it. Because while the noise online continued to thin out into awkward silences and half-explanations, I was doing something much quieter, pulling together documents I had avoided looking at too closely for years. Bank statements that showed regular transfers I'd labeled as help or contribution, old emails where decisions about the house had been phrased as favors instead of obligations, and a scanned copy of a legal document that had always existed in the background of my life, like an inconvenient truth. No one wanted to touch, and going through it all was slower than I expected. Not because it was complicated, but because each page carried the weight of a small compromise I'd made to keep the peace money sent on time even when it strained me, repairs handled without discussion, responsibilities assumed quietly so no one else had to feel pressured. And as I added the numbers up, they formed a total that was impossible to dismiss as symbolic. It was real, tangible, the kind of figure that forces you to stop framing things emotionally and start seeing them structurally. And that was when I made the call. I'd been postponing not to confront anyone, but to confirm what I already knew. Asking simple questions in a neutral tone, listening as the answers came back, just as plainly. Yes, this is valid. Yes, this is enforceable. Yes, this gives you options, and hanging up without any rush of triumph. Only a steady clarity that surprised me with how calm it felt, because this wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about stepping into a role I had technically occupied for a long time without ever fully claiming it. And when my mother called later that week asking if we could talk things through like adults, I noticed how the phrase landed differently now. How it no longer sounded like an invitation to shrink myself to keep the conversation manageable, and I told her we could talk soon, not immediately, not urgently, because for once there was no clock running against me. And that pause did more than any argument ever had. It signaled that whatever came next would happen on different terms, governed less by guilt or habit and more by reality. And I understood then that delayed justice doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It simply changes who has to adjust, who has to ask, and who finally gets to decide how much access they're willing to give back. We met a week later in a place that felt deliberately neutral. A small cafe neither of us loved enough to claim, and I noticed how my mother kept adjusting her bag on the chair beside her, how my father avoided meeting my eyes until he was already speaking, how my sister watched my face as if trying to measure how much distance now existed between who I was and who she remembered, and the conversation unfolded without fireworks, which somehow made it heavier because no one could hide behind raised voices or jokes. And when I explained what I was doing and why I didn't frame it as a threat or a lesson, I described it the way you describe weather, something that was already moving and would continue, whether anyone liked it or not. And they reacted the way people do when they realize a familiar arrangement has quietly expired, with bargaining, with regret that arrived just late enough to feel self-protective, with apologies that focused more on consequences than on impact. And I listened without interrupting, not because I was waiting to forgive, but because I no longer needed to convince anyone of anything. And when it was my turn to speak, I said less than I would have in the past. No history lesson, no catalog of hurts. Just a simple boundary stated clearly what I was willing to discuss going forward and what I wasn't, how our relationship would look if it continued at all. And I could feel the moment land unevenly across the table. Relief for my sister, disbelief for my parents, because it wasn't dramatic enough to argue with, and it wasn't soft enough to rewrite. And afterward, walking back to my car, I noticed how steady my hands were, how the familiar aftershocks of guilt never came, and in the weeks that followed, life didn't become perfect or clean. There were still awkward holidays, still silences where conversations used to be. Still moments when I missed the version of my family that only existed in memory. But there was also something new and durable underneath it all, a sense that I had stopped performing my role and started living inside my own decisions, and the post that had once felt like a public verdict slowly receded into the background, no longer the center of the story, but the point where it changed direction. Because it wasn't the humiliation that defined me, it was the restraint that followed the choice to let reality speak without commentary. And that turned out to be enough not to fix everything, but to finally move forward.